Everyone expected her to fall apart. Instead, 24 hours after her husband married his childhood crush, she was on a date. He thought he had no idea what he had already lost.
By 7:14 the next evening, the entire town of Escabay knew two things: that Holt Bellinger had married Vivienne Lacroix in a quiet courthouse ceremony that morning, and that his ex-wife was sitting in the corner booth of the lantern room, laughing easily with a man none of them recognized, wearing a green dress she had never once worn in 11 years of marriage. Nobody had expected that, least of all Holt. He had built the entire divorce around a story he never said out loud but believed completely: that Noelle Ashford would fall apart the moment he left, that she would call him in tears within the week, that Escabay would watch her grieve and quietly agree he had had no choice. He needed her devastation. Instead, 24 hours after his marriage to Vivienne was final, his ex-wife looked like a woman who had been waiting for this exact evening her whole life. To understand why, you have to go back 2 years, to the night of their 15th high school reunion, when Vivienne Lacroix walked back into Escabay, wearing a coat that cost more than most of the town's mortgages, and a smile that still made Holt Bellinger forget how to finish a sentence. Holt and Noelle had been married for 11 years by then. He ran Bellinger Coastal Properties, the development firm his father had built on 3 generations of waterfront land deals. She restored things: old buildings, old lighthouses, old houses nobody else thought were worth saving. What nobody saw, including Holt, was how long he had been quietly leaving. It did not happen all at once. It happened in the small ways a marriage erodes, in him being short with her, in him bringing up Vivienne's name more than a person should, in the particular silence that fell over dinner when Noelle asked gently if something was wrong, and he said no too quickly. Noelle noticed. Noelle always noticed. She did not fight for it. People in town would later call this cold, and they were wrong. Noelle had spent 2 years already grieving a marriage that had not officially ended yet. By the time Holt finally sat her down at their kitchen table and said Vivienne's name with the particular weight of a confession, Noelle had already done most of her crying in private, in the car, in the bathroom at 2 in the morning, where no one in Escabay could see it and turn it into a story about her. So when he said the words, "I think I have always loved her. I think I owe it to both of us to be honest," Noelle did not scream. She did not beg. She asked him, very simply, when he wanted to start the paperwork, and watched something in his face fall, because he had been braced for a war, and she had handed him a calendar instead. The divorce took 4 months, all of it conducted with a politeness that unsettled Holt more than anger would have. Noelle asked for none of the properties his family had developed. She asked for the Lighthouse, specifically the Esca Point Light, a decommissioned 1880s lighthouse on a half-acre of crumbling granite the Bellinger family had owned for 3 generations and never once maintained, because Holt's father had always considered it worthless land. Holt signed it over without reading the appraisal. It felt at the time like the cheapest thing he would ever give her. It was not. For 2 years before the divorce, Noelle had been the lead architect on the lighthouse's restoration. The structural consultant the grant board brought in was a man named August Reyes, a maritime preservation specialist with calloused hands. He and Noelle had spent 2 years arguing about mortar mixtures and original ironwork, building the kind of respect that does not announce itself until much later. Nothing happened between them while she was married, but August had been there, steady and unhurried, while her marriage quietly came apart somewhere else entirely. The day the divorce was finalized, August asked her to dinner, not as a consolation, as a man who had waited 2 years to ask a married woman to dinner and was no longer willing to wait 1 day longer than he had to. That was the green dress. That was the corner booth at the lantern room. That was the laugh that traveled across the restaurant and reached a table near the door where 2 of Holt's cousins happened to be sitting, and by morning had reached everyone. Vivienne, when she heard, was delighted, in the specific way of a woman who needed Noelle to look pathetic in order to feel like she had won something. She made a comment at brunch, loud enough to be repeated, about how fast some people move on. Holt did not find it delightful. Holt found it unbearable. He had wanted, badly, to be the man who broke a woman's heart and still came out the hero of the story, and instead the town was starting to ask a different question. If Noelle Ashford looked that unbothered, that whole, that quietly thriving, exactly what had he actually been running from? He got his answer 3 weeks later, at a town council hearing he had not bothered to attend in person, sending Vivienne in his place instead, because by then she had taken a sudden, suspicious interest in Bellinger Coastal Properties' remaining waterfront holdings that were only valuable as a single connected parcel if the half-acre in the middle of them, the Esker Point Light, could eventually be quietly rezoned and folded into a larger development. Vivienne had not come back to Esker Bay for nostalgia. She had come back already deep in debt from a real estate venture that collapsed in another state, scouting old hometowns the way some people scout failing companies for a way back to solvency that wore the shape of a love story. Holt Bellinger, sentimental and still half in love with a 15-year-old memory of her, had simply been the easiest door back in. What she had not accounted for was Noelle. 2 years of patient, unglamorous paperwork, easements, historic landmark applications, estate preservation designation Noelle had filed 18 months before anyone suspected she would need it, meant that by the time Vivienne stood up at that hearing and proposed folding the Lighthouse parcel into a coastal redevelopment plan, the Esker Point Light was already legally untouchable, protected, permanently. Noelle had not done it to win a fight she did not know was coming. She had done it because the lighthouse deserved to still be standing in 100 years, and that had simply, finally, also turned out to be the same thing as protecting herself. Holt understood, watching the hearing minutes get read into the record weeks later, exactly what he had handed away and to whom. He had given Noelle the one piece of land that made the rest of his holdings worthless to the woman he had left her for. He had thought it was the cheapest gift he could offer on his way out the door. It turned out to be the only smart thing he did in the entire divorce, and he had not even meant to do it. He showed up at the lighthouse once, unannounced, standing at the base of the scaffolding while August worked above him. He did not apologize, not exactly. He said something about how he had not expected any of this. Not Vivienne's debts, not the rezoning, not the way Noelle had simply, methodically, made herself impossible to outmaneuver without ever raising her voice. Noelle, paint flecked on her hands, told him kindly that she hoped Vivienne's investors were patient people and went back to work. There was no triumphant speech. No door slammed dramatically in his face. That had never been who Noelle was, and it was not the ending she wanted either. What Esker Bay got instead, over the following year, was simpler and harder to gossip about. A restored lighthouse reopened to the public with a small bronze plaque crediting its 2 lead preservationists. A quiet, unhurried relationship between 2 people who had built something real while nobody was watching closely enough to call it a scandal. Noelle never needed the last word. She had already had it, 18 months earlier, in the quiet language of zoning law and granite and patience, long before anyone in town knew there was even a story being written.
Noelle never raised her voice, never asked for revenge. She simply protected what mattered, and let that be enough. Sometimes the loudest victory is the one nobody sees coming, built quietly over years by someone everyone assumed had already lost. If you believe patience can be its own kind of power, hit subscribe. There's a new story like this every week. And tell me in the comments, if you were Noelle, would you have asked for Lighthouse too?